Elderly George Strait fanstorms. The stage falls and gets hurt. But what George did moved everyone. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered farmhouse that Harold Thompson had called home for the better part of 6 decades. At 78 years old, Harold's face was a roadmap of wrinkles that told stories of drought, prosperity, heartbreak and joy, all experienced on this very land. His calloused hands, now trembling slightly, rested on the arm of his favorite rocking chair as he gazed out across the acres that had defined his existence. "Grandpa, your medicine," said Sarah, his 28-year-old granddaughter, placing a small paper cup filled with colorful pills next to his worn-out cowboy hat. "Dr. Mitchell said you need to take these with food." Harold nodded silently, his blue eyes, still sharp despite the years, fixed on the horizon. The radio in the corner of the porch played softly, a familiar voice singing about Amarillo mornings and rodeo dreams. The sound of George Strait's smooth baritone had been the soundtrack to Harold's life since the singer first appeared on the country music scene in the early 1980s. If you're enjoying this story about country music legends and their incredible fans, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the power of music and human connection. Did I ever tell you about the time your grandmother and I danced to the chair at our 30th anniversary? Harold asked, a slight smile forming beneath his silver mustache. She was prettier that night than the day I married her. Sarah sat down beside him, having heard the story countless times, but never tiring of it. "Tell me again, Grandpa." Harold closed his eyes, and for a moment he was transported back to that evening. Margaret in her blue dress, her grey-streaked hair pinned up elegantly, her laugh still the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. The memory was a momentary respite from the pain that had become his constant companion over the past 8 months. "Stage 4, the doctor had said with practiced sympathy. 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis had come like a sudden Texas storm, unexpected and devastating. Harold had opted out of the chemotherapy that promised nothing but misery in his final days. "I've lived on my own terms," he had told his family, "and I'll die on them too." Now, with the doctor's predicted timeline drawing to a close, Harold found himself dwelling on the things he'd never done, the regrets that visit all men in their final hours. One in particular had been gnawing at him. In all his years of listening to George Strait's music, through cattle drives and barn raisings, through Margaret's passing 5 years ago, through the birth of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, he had never seen the King of Country perform live. "Sarah," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "George Strait is playing in Dallas next weekend." Sarah looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing with concern. "Grandpa, Dallas is 4 hours away. I don't think I've been saving," Harold interrupted, reaching for the old coffee can he kept by his chair. $312. Been putting aside my medication money." "Grandpa," Sarah's voice rose in alarm, "you can't skip your medication." Harold waved away her concern. "Pain pills. Don't worry, I've been taking the important ones, but the others just make me sleep. And I've got eternity for that soon enough." He placed a weathered hand on hers. "This is important to me, Sarah. Before I go, I want to hear him sing The Chair and Amarillo by Morning live. I want to thank him somehow for being with me through everything." Sarah's eyes welled with tears. She knew better than to argue with her grandfather when he had set his mind to something. "I'll talk to Michael and see if we can make it happen," she said, referring to her brother. "But you have to promise to take all your medication until then." Harold's face lit up with a joy that Sarah hadn't seen since before his diagnosis. "Deal," he said, squeezing her hand with surprising strength. That evening, Sarah and Michael sat at the kitchen table after Harold had gone to bed, discussing the logistics of getting their grandfather to the George Strait concert. He can barely make it to the bathroom without help some days, Michael argued, running a hand through his dark hair, so much like Harold's had been in his youth. How is he going to handle a crowded arena? He wants this, Michael, Sarah replied firmly. He's never asked for anything. After Mum and Dad died, he raised us without complaint. He worked this ranch until his hands bled to put us through college. If his last wish is to see George Strait, then I'm going to make sure he sees George Strait. Michael's resistance crumbled under the weight of her words. Fine, he conceded, but we're getting wheelchair-accessible seats, and I'm bringing his oxygen tank, whether he likes it or not. The next morning, Sarah presented Harold with 3 tickets to the George Strait concert in Dallas. Good seats, not the best, but the best they could afford on short notice. Harold held the tickets with reverence, as if they were made of fine china rather than paper and ink. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." The week leading up to the concert saw a remarkable change in Harold. He took his medication without complaint, ate more than he had in months, and even ventured out to the barn to visit his old quarter horse, Thunder, who was now as grey and arthritic as his master. The anticipation seemed to breathe new life into his failing body. The day before the concert, Harold insisted on getting a haircut in town. The local barber, Jim Haskins, had been cutting Harold's hair for over 40 years and knew without asking that this wasn't just any haircut. "Special occasion, Harold?" Jim asked as he draped the cape around Harold's thin shoulders. "Going to see George Strait tomorrow," Harold replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "In Dallas." Jim's scissors paused mid-snip. Everyone in town knew about Harold's condition. "That's quite a trip in your state." Harold's reflection smiled in the mirror. "Some trips are worth taking, no matter the cost." Jim nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his old friend's words. "Well then, let's make sure you look your best for the king of country." When Harold emerged from the barbershop, his white hair neatly trimmed and his mustache shaped to perfection, he felt a dignity that the disease had stolen from him months ago. Back at the ranch, he insisted on pressing his own shirt for the concert, a Western-style button-up that Margaret had given him for their last Christmas together. He polished his best boots, the ones he now saved for special occasions, and laid out his favorite bolo tie. That night, he could hardly sleep. The pain was there, as it always was, but it was overshadowed by an excitement he hadn't felt in years. He lay awake, listening to George Strait songs on the small radio beside his bed, mouthing the lyrics he knew by heart. The morning of the concert dawned clear and cool, a perfect October day in Texas. Sarah and Michael arrived early, bringing with them a wheelchair that Harold insisted he wouldn't need. "Just in case," Sarah said firmly, refusing to take no for an answer. "The arena is huge, Grandpa." Harold relented, but only after extracting a promise that they wouldn't make him use it unless absolutely necessary. "I'm going to walk in there, on my own 2 feet, he declared. "A man should stand for the things that matter." The drive to Dallas was filled with George Strait's greatest hits playing on the car stereo, and Harold sharing stories about each song. Where he was when he first heard it, what it meant to him, how Margaret had loved this one or that one. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances in the front seat, silently acknowledging the gift of seeing their grandfather so animated after months of watching him fade away. As they approached the American Airlines Center, Harold's eyes widened at the sight of the massive venue and the crowds already gathering outside. People of all ages streamed toward the entrances, many wearing cowboy hats and boots, united by their love for the man who had defined country music for generations. "Look at all these people," Harold marveled, "all here for George." Michael found a parking spot in the handicap section, thanks to the temporary permit they had acquired for Harold. As they helped him out of the car, Harold stood for a moment, taking in the scene, breathing deeply, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You okay, Grandpa?" Sarah asked, noticing his sudden stillness. Harold nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Just thinking about how your grandmother would have loved this. She always said we should see him in concert someday." He straightened his shoulders. "Well, I'm seeing him for both of us today." The walk to the entrance was slow but steady, Harold refusing any assistance beyond Sarah's supportive arm. His determined stride belied the pain evident in the tightness around his eyes. As they approached the security checkpoint, a young guard noticed Harold's labored breathing. "Sir, would you like to use the accessible entrance?" The guard offered kindly. "It's less crowded." Harold was about to decline when a sharp pain lanced through his abdomen, nearly doubling him over. Michael was at his side, instantly supporting his weight. "Yes, thank you," Sarah answered for him, shooting her grandfather a look that brooked no argument. This time, Harold didn't protest. The accessible entrance led them through a shorter line and into the cool interior of the arena. Harold sank gratefully into the wheelchair they had brought, though his pride was clearly wounded by the necessity. "Just until we get to our seats," he insisted. "Then I'm standing up. I didn't come all this way to sit down for George Strait." Their seats were on the lower level, not floor seats, but with a decent view of the stage. As Michael helped Harold into his seat, Sarah went in search of water and any medication Harold might need during the show. The arena was filling up quickly, the excited buzz of conversation creating a palpable energy that even Harold could feel despite his fatigue. "Look at that stage," Harold said to Michael, pointing to the massive setup with its state-of-the-art sound system and lighting rigs. "A far cry from the county fairs where I first heard about him." Michael smiled, relieved to see his grandfather's spirits so high. "He's come a long way from playing in Texas dance halls." "We all have," Harold replied, his gaze distant for a moment. "But some journeys are worth every step." As the opening act took the stage, Harold sat up straighter in his seat, his pain momentarily forgotten in the wash of music and anticipation. Sarah returned with bottles of water and settled in beside him, her hand finding his. "Thank you for this," Harold said, his voice barely audible over the music. "This means everything to me." Sarah squeezed his hand in response, her throat too tight for words. They both knew what remained unspoken, that this was likely the last concert, the last big event, the last of so many things for Harold Thompson. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by thousands of strangers united by music, Harold wasn't a dying man. He was simply a fan, waiting to see his hero. The opening act finished to enthusiastic applause, and the lights came up for the changeover. Harold used the opportunity to stand and stretch, wincing slightly, but determined not to show how much the simple movement cost him. "Do you need anything, Grandpa?" Michael asked, hovering nearby. Harold shook his head. "Just to be here," he said. "And I am." As the minutes ticked by, the anticipation in the arena grew. The crowd began to chant George's name, the sound rising and falling like waves. Harold joined in, his voice weak, but his enthusiasm undimmed. And then, finally, the lights dimmed, and a roar went up from the crowd that Harold felt in his very bones. In that moment, as the first chords of Amarillo by Morning filled the arena and George Strait stepped into the spotlight, Harold Thompson felt the weight of his years and his illness fall away. Tears streamed unashamedly down his weathered cheeks as the voice that had accompanied him through the milestones of his life rang out clear and true in person at last. "Grandpa?" Sarah's concerned voice came from beside him. "Are you okay?" Harold turned to her, his face transformed by a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "I've never been better," he said, and for that perfect moment it was absolutely true. As George Strait worked through his opening numbers, Harold stood transfixed, swaying slightly to the music that had been the backdrop to his life. The pain that had been his constant companion these past months seemed to recede, pushed back by the pure joy of finally seeing the king of country in person. Each song brought with it a flood of memories. Cattle drives with The Cowboy Rides Away playing on the truck radio, slow dancing with Margaret in their living room to I Cross My Heart, teaching his children to two-step to All My Exes Live. In Texas, "He's even better in person," Harold said to Sarah, raising his voice to be heard over the crowd and the music. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Seeing her grandfather like this, alive in a way he hadn't been since the diagnosis, was a gift she hadn't anticipated. "He sure is, Grandpa." As the show progressed, Harold began to feel a growing sense of urgency. He had come all this way, defied doctors' orders and his own failing body, but something was missing. Seeing George Strait from a distance wasn't enough. The desire to meet the man, to shake his hand and tell him what his music had meant, began to overshadow everything else. During a brief pause between songs, Harold turned to Michael. "I need to meet him," he said with sudden determination. "I need to thank him personally." Michael's brow furrowed with concern. "Grandpa, that's not possible. He's George Strait. You need special passes for that sort of thing." "There has to be a way," Harold insisted, a familiar, stubborn set to his jaw that both his grandchildren recognized all too well. "Maybe after the show, we could wait by his bus or something." Sarah exchanged a worried glance with her brother. "Grandpa, there will be security everywhere. And you're already pushing yourself too hard just being here." Harold's face fell, the disappointment etched deeply into the lines around his eyes. "I might not get another chance," he said softly, and the weight of those words hung heavy in the air between them. After a moment of silence, Sarah squeezed her grandfather's hand. "Let me see what I can find out." As George Strait launched into The Chair, Harold's favorite song, Sarah slipped away from their seats. She made her way toward the security personnel stationed at the entrance to their section, her mind racing with how to explain their situation. The security guard was a tall man with a shaved head and an earpiece, his face set in the impassive expression of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. His name tag read Curtis. "Excuse me," Sarah began, raising her voice to be heard over the music. "My grandfather is very ill, terminal cancer, and his last wish is to meet George Strait. Is there any way that could be arranged? Even just for a moment after the show?" Curtis barely glanced at her. "Mom, everyone wants to meet George Strait. We get hundreds of these requests at every show." "I understand that," Sarah pressed, "but this is different. My grandfather literally used his medication money to buy these tickets. He's got maybe a month left, if that." Curtis sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested he'd heard similar stories before. "Look, I'm sorry about your grandfather, truly, but Mr. Strait's schedule is extremely tight. He has a strict policy about meet and greets. They're arranged well in advance through his management. There's nothing I can do." Sarah felt a flash of frustration. "Can you at least pass along the request? Please? It would mean the world to him." "Ma'am, I don't have direct contact with Mr. Strait or his team," Curtis explained, his tone softening slightly. "The best I can do is tell you to write to his fan club or reach out through official channels. He doesn't have that kind of time," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. Curtis shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, but those are the rules. I need to ask you to return to your seat now." Defeated, Sarah made her way back to where Harold and Michael were sitting. Harold's eyes were closed, his face transported by The Chair, as George Strait's voice filled the arena. She couldn't bring herself to interrupt this moment of pure happiness with disappointment. When the song ended, Harold opened his eyes and noticed Sarah's return. "Any luck?" he asked hopefully. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. They said, "It's not possible, Grandpa. All meet and greets are arranged months in advance." Harold nodded slowly, absorbing the news. For a moment, he looked every bit his 78 years, the brief reprieve from his illness seeming to evaporate. Then he straightened in his seat. "Well, at least I got to hear him sing The Chair live. That's something Margaret and I always dreamed about." The show continued, George Strait moving through his impressive catalogue of hits. During Amarillo by Morning, Harold began to sing along, his voice thin but passionate, carrying decades of connection to the lyrics about rodeos and drifting cowboys. As the song approached its final chorus, Harold suddenly gripped the armrests of his seat, his knuckles turning white. "I need to try," he said, more to himself than to his grandchildren. "Try what, Grandpa?" Michael asked, distracted by the performance. Harold didn't answer. Instead, he rose from his seat with a determination that belied his frail condition. Before either Sarah or Michael could react, he began moving toward the aisle. "Grandpa, where are you going?" Sarah called after him, alarmed by the sudden movement. "To meet George Strait," Harold replied without turning around, his voice carrying a finality that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Michael jumped up to follow, but the crowded row made it difficult to move quickly. "Grandpa, wait!" Harold had already reached the aisle and was moving with surprising speed toward the front of the section. Decades of working on the ranch had given him a wiry strength that his illness hadn't completely stolen. He had a destination in mind, a small set of steps he had noticed earlier that led from the floor seating area up to the stage. Security was focused on the fans pressed against the barricade directly in front of the stage, not expecting a threat to come from the side. Harold used this to his advantage, slipping past distracted guards and making his way closer to the stage with each passing moment. Michael had finally extricated himself from their row and was following his grandfather, with Sarah close behind. "Grandpa, stop!" Michael called out, drawing the attention of nearby concert-goers, but not Harold, who seemed deaf to everything, except the music pulling him forward. A security guard finally noticed the elderly man moving purposefully toward a restricted area. Sir, you can't go that way," he called out, moving to intercept Harold. Harold saw the guard approaching and made a split-second decision. With a burst of energy he didn't know he still possessed, he dodged around the security guard and hurried toward the steps leading to the stage. The guard, caught off guard by the elderly man's unexpected agility, stumbled slightly before recovering and radioing for backup. "We have a situation in Section 103, elderly male attempting to access the stage." His voice crackled over the security channel. By now, Harold had reached the steps. His heart was pounding dangerously in his chest, and each breath felt like fire in his lungs, but he was determined. 3 steps up, and he would be on the stage with George Strait. 3 steps between him and fulfilling a lifetime's dream. As Harold placed his foot on the first step, he felt a hand grab his arm. He turned to find himself face to face with a different security guard, younger, more intimidating, with a stern expression that brooked no argument. His name tag read, Russell. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," Russell said firmly, his grip on Harold's arm unyielding. "Please," Harold gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "I just need a moment with him. I'm dying. Cancer. This is my last chance." Russell's expression didn't soften. If anything, his grip tightened slightly. "Sir, I've heard every excuse in the book. Mr. Strait doesn't do impromptu meet and greets, especially not with people who try to rush the stage." "It's not an excuse," Harold pleaded, his voice breaking. "I've got the medical bracelet to prove it." He held up his wrist, where the medical alert bracelet detailing his condition was clearly visible. Russell barely glanced at it. Even if that's true, rules are rules. Stars like George Strait don't have time for every sob story that comes their way. He's got 20,000 fans here tonight, and they all paid for tickets just like you did. The cruel dismissal hit Harold like a physical blow. He felt his knees weaken, a combination of exertion, emotion, and the reality of his illness catching up to him all at once. "You don't understand." Harold tried one more time, his voice now barely audible over the music. "His songs kept me going after my wife died, after my son and daughter-in-law were killed in that accident. His music was there when nothing else was." "Save it for the fan mail," Russell replied coldly, beginning to pull Harold away from the steps. "Old guys like you need to know their limits. George Strait doesn't waste time with dying old men." The words hung in the air between them, cruel and dismissive. Harold felt something break inside him. Not his body, which had already been broken by disease, but something deeper. The dream that had sustained him these last difficult months shattered in an instant. Just then, Michael and Sarah caught up to them, both out of breath from pushing through the crowd. "Grandpa!" Sarah cried, taking in the scene with horror. "What are you doing?" "Sir, is this man with you?" Russell asked, still gripping Harold's arm tightly enough to leave marks. "He's our grandfather," Michael explained quickly. "I'm sorry about this. He's not well." "Well, get him back to his seat and keep him there," Russell ordered. "One more stunt like this, and you'll all be escorted out of the arena." As Russell released his grip, Harold swayed dangerously. Michael quickly moved to support him, alarmed by how pale his grandfather had become. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Sarah asked, taking his other arm. Harold didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the stage, where George Strait continued to perform, completely unaware of the small drama playing out just feet away from him. So close, yet impossibly far. "Let's get you back to your seat," Michael said gently, beginning to guide Harold away from the steps. "No," Harold said suddenly, his voice finding strength from some reserve deep within. "No, I'm not giving up." Before either of his grandchildren could react, Harold pulled away from their supporting arms and lunged toward the steps. Russell, who had turned his attention elsewhere, thinking the situation resolved, spun around too late to stop him. In 3 quick steps, fueled by determination and desperation, Harold Thompson was on the stage of the American Airlines Center, in the middle of a George Strait concert, with 20,000 stunned fans watching. The spotlight caught him as he stumbled forward, momentarily blinding him. George Strait, consummate professional that he was, continued singing Troubadour while glancing questioningly at the elderly man who had suddenly appeared on his stage. Harold took one step toward his idol, his hand outstretched, his mouth forming words that no one could hear over the music. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Harold's strength deserted him. The exertion, the excitement, the cancer that was consuming him from the inside, it all caught up in a single catastrophic moment. Harold's legs buckled beneath him. He tried to catch himself, but his reflexes, dulled by age and illness, failed him. He fell hard, his head striking the edge of a monitor speaker with a sickening sound that was audible even over the music and the crowd. A collective gasp rippled through the arena. George Strait stopped mid-verse, the band faltering to an awkward halt behind him. The music died, replaced by the murmurs of 20,000 voices trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. Blood began to pool around Harold's head where it had struck the speaker, a stark crimson against the polished black stage. Security, guards rushed forward, finally reacting to the situation, but they were too late to prevent the fall that had already occurred. From their position near the steps, Sarah screamed, a sound of pure anguish that cut through the confused murmurs of the crowd. "Grandpa!" Michael was already pushing past Russell, taking the steps 2 at a time to reach his grandfather. Sarah followed close behind, tears streaming down her face. The security team, including Russell, moved to intercept them, but a voice cut through the chaos, George Strait himself. "Let them through," he commanded, his microphone still live, his voice echoing through the arena. "And get a medic up here now!" The guards hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Sarah and Michael to rush to Harold's side. Harold lay motionless on the stage, blood matting his silver hair, his face ashen. The fall had reopened a wound from a recent biopsy, and the blood loss was severe. Sarah fell to her knees beside her grandfather, cradling his head gently in her lap, heedless of the blood soaking into her clothes. "Grandpa, can you hear me?" she sobbed, pressing her fingers to his neck, desperately searching for a pulse. Michael stood frozen in shock, unable to process the sight of his strong, stubborn grandfather laid low in such a public and devastating way. The dream that had given Harold such joy just moments before had turned into a nightmare none of them could have anticipated. As medical personnel rushed onto the stage with a gurney and emergency equipment, the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone present. What had started as a simple wish, an old man wanting to thank the artist whose music had carried him through life's darkest moments, had ended in tragedy. Or had it? As the paramedics worked to stabilize Harold, no one noticed George Strait moving closer, his face a mask of concern and confusion. No one, that is, except for Russell, the security guard, whose cruel words had been the final push that sent Harold Thompson onto that stage. Russell stepped forward, his hand raised as if to stop the country music legend from getting too close to the unfolding medical emergency. "Mr. Strait, sir, I'm sorry about this interruption. We'll get him off your stage right away." George Strait's eyes, normally warm and friendly in interviews and photographs, turned cold as ice as they fixed on Russell. "What did you say to him?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "Before he ran up here, what did you say to that man?" Russell's face paled under George Strait's intense gaze. The arena had gone completely silent, 20,000 people collectively, holding their breath as they watched the drama unfolding on stage. The only sounds were the urgent instructions of the medical team working on Harold and the soft sobs coming from Sarah as she clutched her grandfather's hand. "Mr. Strait, I was just doing my job," Russell stammered, taking a step back from the country music legend's unexpected fury. George didn't budge. "That's not what I asked you. What did you say to him?" Before Russell could formulate a response, Michael stepped forward, his face contorted with grief and anger. "He told my grandfather that stars like George Strait don't waste time with dying old men." Michael's voice broke as he repeated the cruel words. "My grandfather has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He spent his medication money to be here tonight because seeing you perform was his last wish." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the front rows of the audience as people began to understand what had happened. George Strait stood motionless, processing this information, his normally composed face reflecting a complex mix of emotions. One of the paramedics looked up from where they were working on Harold. "We need to get him to hospital immediately. He's stabilized for now, but he's lost a lot of blood, and with his condition," George nodded, then turned to his stage manager who had appeared at his side. "Dave, call my personal physician. Tell him to meet us at Baylor University Medical Center and get my car ready." The stage manager looked startled, but nodded and stepped away, already pulling out his phone. George then turned back to Michael and Sarah. "I'm going with you to the hospital." Sarah looked up in disbelief, her face streaked with tears and her hands covered in her grandfather's blood. "What?" "Your grandfather came here to see me," George said simply. "The least I can do is make sure he's taken care of now." As the paramedics prepared to move Harold onto the gurney, George turned to address the stunned audience. The consummate professional, even in crisis, he stepped up to the microphone. "Folks, we've had an emergency situation develop here," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm going to have to cut tonight's show short. Everyone will receive information about refunds or rescheduling, but right now, I need to make sure this gentleman gets the care he needs." A murmur ran through the crowd, but it wasn't one of disappointment. Instead, there was a ripple of understanding, even approval. Then, spontaneously, someone in the audience began to applaud. The applause spread like wildfire until the entire arena was filled with the sound of 20,000 people showing their support, not just for their musical hero, but for his humanity. George nodded his thanks to the audience, then stepped away from the microphone and moved quickly to where the paramedics were now lifting Harold onto the gurney. As they secured him for transport, Harold's eyes fluttered open briefly. His gaze, unfocused at first, settled on George Strait, standing beside him. "Mr. Strait," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible, "I just wanted to thank you." George leaned closer to hear the weak words. "Save your strength, sir. We'll have plenty of time to talk later." Harold's eyes closed again as the paramedics began to wheel him toward the backstage area. George walked alongside the gurney, with Sarah and Michael following close behind, still trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Backstage was a flurry of activity. George's team had already called ahead to the hospital and arranged for his personal physician to meet them there. His security detail was organizing a small convoy. One vehicle for the ambulance, one for George, and one for Sarah and Michael. As they reached the loading dock where the ambulance waited, George pulled his tour manager aside. "Cancel tomorrow night's show in Houston," he said firmly. "We'll reschedule." The tour manager's eyes widened. "George, that's a sold-out arena. 22,000 tickets." "I don't care if it's 50,000, George replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is more important." As the paramedics loaded Harold into the ambulance, Sarah turned to George, her eyes filled with gratitude and confusion. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know him." George's weathered face softened. "Ma'am, I've been making music for over 40 years because of people like your grandfather, folks who work hard all their lives and find something in my songs that speaks to them." He glanced at the ambulance where Harold lay. "He wanted to thank me? The truth is, I owe him and every fan like him a debt I can never repay." Sarah's composure finally broke completely, and she collapsed into sobs. Michael put an arm around his sister while extending his hand to George. "Thank you, Mr. Strait. This would mean the world to him." George shook Michael's hand firmly. "Please call me George, and don't thank me yet. Let's just make sure your grandfather gets the help he needs." The ride to Baylor University Medical Center was surreal. Sarah and Michael followed the ambulance in a black SUV provided by George's team, neither of them quite able to believe the turn their evening had taken. What had started as fulfilling their grandfather's last wish had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. At the hospital, Harold was immediately taken to the emergency department. George's personal physician, Dr. Langston, was waiting as promised and quickly took charge of Harold's care, consulting with the hospital's oncology team given the complexity of his condition. Sarah, Michael, and George settled into a private waiting room that had been arranged for them. The hospital administration, recognizing the high-profile nature of their unexpected visitor, had moved quickly to ensure privacy and comfort. As they waited for news about Harold, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Sarah sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the door, waiting for a doctor to appear with news. Michael paced the small room, unable to settle. The adrenaline of the evening still coursing through his system. George sat quietly in a corner chair, his hat resting on his knee, his presence both comforting and surreal in its unexpectedness. After several minutes of silence, he spoke. "Tell me about your grandfather." Sarah looked up, startled by the question. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," George replied simply. "What kind of man risks everything to stand on a stage?" In front of 20,000 people just to say thank you. Michael stopped pacing and sat down beside his sister. Grandpa's the toughest man I've ever known, he said, a hint of pride cutting through his worry. Ran the ranch by himself after. Grandma died 5 years ago, right up until the cancer diagnosis 8 months back. The ranch has been in our family for 4 generations, Sarah added. When our parents died in a car accident 15 years ago, Grandpa and Grandma raised us. He never complained, never showed weakness, just did what needed to be done. George nodded, understanding in his eyes. He came from the same stock, people who measured their worth by their work and their word. And my music, he mentioned something about it helping him. Sarah smiled faintly. Your songs have been the soundtrack to his life. That's how he always put it. After Grandma died, he would sit on the porch every evening and listen to your albums. Said your voice kept him company when the house got too quiet. The night our parents died, Michael added, his voice dropping, Grandpa sat us down and played Love Without End Amen for us. Said as long as we remembered love doesn't end. Just because someone's gone, we'd be okay. He swallowed hard. I was 12. That song got me through some pretty dark nights. George's eyes glistened in the harsh fluorescent light of the waiting room. For a man who had performed for presidents and sold out stadiums around the world, he appeared genuinely moved by the impact his music had had on this one family. I never take it for granted, he said quietly, the way music can reach people, but sometimes I forget just how deep it goes. He shook his head. And to think that security guard spoke to him that way. It wasn't just the guard, Sarah admitted, guilt creasing her forehead. We tried to talk him out of coming tonight. The doctors said traveling would be too much strain on his system, but he insisted, said if he was going to die anyway, he wanted to do it after hearing you sing. The chair lived just once. The door to the waiting room opened, and Dr. Langston entered, his face carefully neutral in the way that doctors learn to mask both good and bad news. All 3 stood up immediately. How is he? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. Dr. Langston sighed. He's stable for now. The fall caused a laceration that required stitches, and he lost quite a bit of blood, which is concerning given his condition. But the bigger issue is that the exertion and stress have accelerated his decline. His latest scans from his oncologist showed the cancer has spread more extensively than previously thought. What does that mean? Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. It means we're looking at weeks now, not months, Dr. Langston said gently. I'm sorry. Sarah made a small, wounded sound and turned away. Michael put his arm around her shoulders, his own face rigid with the effort of staying strong. Can we see him? George asked, surprising everyone in the room. Dr. Langston nodded. He's asking for you, actually, Mr. Strait. All of you. He's conscious and lucid, though we've given him medication for the pain. Room 312. The 3 made their way to Harold's room in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they entered, the sight of Harold Thompson laid out in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and IVs, his white hair stark against the pallor of his skin, hit them all hard. But Harold's eyes were open, and when he saw George Strait enter the room behind his grandchildren, a smile transformed his tired face. You came, he said, his voice weak but clear. Of course I did, George replied, moving to stand beside the bed. I hear you went to a lot of trouble to meet me. A ghost of Harold's dry humor flickered across his face. Not exactly how I planned it. Sarah moved to her grandfather's other side, taking his hand carefully around the IV line. Grandpa, what were you thinking? You could have... She stopped, herself, realizing the futility of scolding a dying man for risking his life. I was thinking that some chances are worth taking, Harold replied, squeezing her hand weakly. And I was right. His gaze returned to George. I've been listening to your music since you first came on the scene. Saw you once at a county fair in '82 or '83 before you got real famous. Told my Margaret then that you were going to be something special." George smiled. "I remember those county fair days. Lot of dust and not much of a sound system. But the music came through," Harold said. "It always did." He paused, gathering strength. "I just wanted to thank you. Your songs have been with me through everything, good times and bad. When Margaret died, when I got this diagnosis, your music reminded me that life keeps moving no matter what." George Strait, the king of country, the man who had performed for millions throughout his career, found himself momentarily speechless. In the face of such simple, profound gratitude, he reached out and placed his hand on Harold's shoulder. "Sir, it's me who should be thanking you," he said finally. "Fans like you are why I've been able to do what I love all these years." Harold's eyes shone with emotion. "Would you mind? Could I ask you to sing something? Just a verse? I know it's asking a lot, but—" "It would be my honor," George interrupted. "Any requests?" "The Chair," Harold said without hesitation. "It was Margaret's favorite. We danced to it at our daughter's wedding." George nodded, and without fanfare or accompaniment began to sing softly. His voice, even in this intimate setting, was as rich and true as it had been on the stage earlier that evening. He sang not just the first verse, but the entire song, his eyes never leaving Harold's face. As the last notes faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the nurse, who had paused in the doorway to listen, was wiping away tears. "Thank you," Harold whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That was worth everything." George cleared his throat, fighting back his own emotions. "Mr. Thompson?" "Harold, please." "Harold," George corrected himself. "I've been thinking. My next show is in Houston, but I've decided to postpone it. I'd like to stay here in Dallas another day, if that's all right with you." Harold looked confused. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'd like to hear more of your stories," George said simply. "About your ranch, about Margaret, about what my songs have meant to you over the years, if you're up to it, that is." The look of wonder that spread across Harold's face was something none of them would ever forget. "You want to hear my stories?" "I do," George confirmed. "And I thought maybe tomorrow, if the doctors say it's okay, we could have a proper visit. No rushing, no falls, no emergencies, just conversation between two old cowboys." Harold's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Strait." "George," he corrected gently. "And it's settled then. I'll be back tomorrow morning." As George prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, Harold called out to him once more. "George?" The country star turned at the door. "Yes, Harold?" "When you write your next song," Harold said, his voice fading as the medication began to pull him towards sleep, "remember that your music doesn't just entertain folks. For some of us, it's been a lifeline, a reason to keep going when there didn't seem to be any reason left." George nodded, visibly moved. "I'll remember that, Harold. I promise." As George left the hospital room, accompanied by Michael, who was going to walk him out, Sarah remained at her grandfather's bedside, holding his hand as he drifted off to sleep. The events of the evening replayed in her mind. The concert, the fall, the unexpected compassion of a music legend who could have easily dismissed them, but instead chose to show extraordinary kindness. She thought about what her grandfather had said about taking chances, about some risks being worth it. Looking at the peaceful expression on his face now, she knew he had been right. Whatever time he had left, days, weeks, perhaps even a few precious months, he would have this moment. This connection, this validation of what music had meant in his life. Outside in the hospital corridor, Michael walked alongside George Strait toward the exit, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said finally. "What you're doing for my grandfather, it's beyond anything we could have hoped for." George stopped walking and turned to face Michael, You know, in all my years of performing, I've signed thousands of autographs, taken countless photos with fans, but I've rarely had the chance to really understand what my music means to people on a personal level. He glanced back toward Harold's room. Your grandfather is giving me a gift, not the other way around. As they reached the hospital entrance, George paused again. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you, he said, his expression turning serious. Your grandfather mentioned he was worried about the ranch, about what would happen to it after he's gone. Michael nodded, surprise registering on his face that Harold had shared such a private concern. It's been tough. The medical bills have eaten into whatever savings he had. Sarah and I both have jobs in the city. We've been trying to figure out how to keep the ranch going, but without Grandpa running things. George considered this for a moment. I know a thing or two about ranching, he said. And I know some good people who might be able to help. If you're open to it, I'd like to have a longer conversation about this tomorrow. See if there's a way to honor your grandfather's legacy by keeping that land in your family. Michael stared at the country star in disbelief. You would do that for a man you just met tonight? George smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. Harold Thompson may have just come into my life tonight, but from what I can tell, he's the kind of man this world needs more of, not less. And if I can help preserve something that matters to him, well, that seems like the right thing to do. As George finally departed and Michael made his way back to Harold's room, neither man was aware of the hospital security camera that had captured their conversation, or of the young nurse who had overheard everything and was already texting her friend about the incredible act of kindness she had just witnessed from one of country music's biggest stars. By morning, the story of George Strait, Harold Thompson, and an extraordinary act of compassion would begin to spread, touching hearts far beyond the walls of that Dallas hospital. By the time morning arrived in Dallas, videos of George Strait stopping his concert to help an elderly man who had collapsed on stage had already gone viral across social media platforms. Thousands of concertgoers had captured the moment on their phones, the music legend kneeling beside Harold, the way he had ordered the medical team to work quickly, and most impressively, to many viewers, how he had walked alongside the gurney as Harold was taken backstage. At Baylor University Medical Center, Harold Thompson slept peacefully, the white bandage stark against his silver hair. Sarah had spent the night in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, dozing fitfully, while Michael had gone to collect their grandfather's belongings from the hotel. Just after 8:30, there was a gentle knock at the hospital room door. Sarah looked up, expecting a nurse, and instead found herself staring at George Strait. The George Strait, standing in the doorway without fanfare, dressed simply in jeans and a button-up shirt, his signature cowboy hat held respectfully in his hands. "Morning," he said softly. "Hope I'm not too early." Sarah quickly smoothed her rumpled clothes, trying to process that this wasn't some exhaustion-induced hallucination. "No, not at all. Please come in." George entered quietly, his gaze moving immediately to Harold's sleeping form. "How is he doing?" "Better than expected, considering," Sarah replied, her voice hushed. "The doctor said the cut on his head looks worse than it is, but the fall—" She hesitated. "It accelerated things with his condition. They're saying weeks now, not months." George's face showed genuine concern. "I'm real sorry to hear that." He pulled up a chair beside Sarah's. "Your brother told me a little about him last night, said he's been a rancher his whole life." 4 generations on the same land, Sarah confirmed, pride momentarily overriding her exhaustion. "He raised us after our parents died in a car accident. Managed the ranch and 2 grieving grandkids without ever complaining once." She glanced at George shyly. "And he's been listening to your music since before I was born. It's been important to him in ways I probably don't even know." George nodded thoughtfully. That means a lot to hear. He paused, then added with careful neutrality, Michael also mentioned something about an incident with one of the security guards before your grandfather came on stage. Sarah's expression darkened immediately. Russell. He was horrible to Grandpa, told him that stars like you don't waste time with dying old men. Her voice caught on the cruel words. I think that's what pushed him to do something so desperate. He just wanted to say thank you before... She couldn't finish. The change in George's expression was subtle, but significant. A hardening. Around the eyes, a tightness at the corners of his mouth. It was a rare glimpse of anger from the normally composed performer. That's completely unacceptable. Their conversation was interrupted by movement from the bed as Harold stirred. His eyes blinking open slowly. For a moment he seemed disoriented, then his gaze focused on George sitting beside his bed. His weathered face registered pure disbelief. Am I dreaming? Harold asked, his voice raspy from sleep and medication. George smiled warmly. No, sir. You're not dreaming, though I have to say you know how to make quite an entrance at a concert. A faint flush colored Harold's pale cheeks. Not exactly how I planned to meet you. Well, I'm glad we're meeting now, George replied sincerely. Your grandchildren have been telling me about you, about your ranch, about how you raised them, about what music has meant to you over the years. Harold's eyes grew suspiciously bright. Your songs have been with me through everything. Margaret's passing, my diagnosis, all of it. He hesitated, then added, I just wanted to thank you. Before my time's up. I understand, George said quietly, and I'm honored, truly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Michael, who stopped short in the doorway, momentarily stunned to find George Strait casually chatting with his grandfather, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Mr. Strait, I didn't expect to see you here so early, Michael said, composing himself quickly. Please call me George, he insisted, standing to shake Michael's hand. I was just telling your grandfather how glad I am to meet him, though I wish it had been under better circumstances. Just as Michael was about to respond, the door opened again, and a man in an expensive suit entered the room. His badge identified him as Robert Keller, head of security for the American Airlines Center. Mr. Strait, Keller began formally. I apologize for interrupting. I wanted to personally express our deepest regrets about what happened last night. George nodded curtly but didn't speak, his expression making it clear he expected more than just a generic apology. Keller continued. We've reviewed the security footage and interviewed several staff members. The behavior of one of our employees toward Mr. Thompson was completely unacceptable and goes against all our protocols and values. He turned to Harold. Sir, I want to personally apologize for how you were treated. Harold, ever gracious, waved a hand dismissively. Water under the bridge now. No, George said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in his voice. It's not. What happened last night matters, and it needs to be addressed. He fixed Keller with an unwavering gaze. Is Russell here? Keller shifted uncomfortably. He's waiting outside. I wanted to speak with you first. Bring him in, George interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Keller hesitated, then nodded and stepped out. A moment later, he returned with Russell in tow. The security guard looked markedly different from the previous night, his arrogant demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. He couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. The room fell silent as Russell stood awkwardly just inside the doorway. George observed him for a long moment, then spoke, his voice deceptively calm. Do you know who I am? He asked. Russell swallowed visibly. Yes, sir, Mr. Strait. And do you know who this man is? George continued, gesturing toward Harold. Mr. Thompson, sir. George nodded slowly. That's right. Now, I'd like you to explain to me, in your own words, what you said to Mr. Thompson last night before he came on stage. Russell's face flushed with shame. I told him that stars like you don't have time for... He faltered, unable to repeat his cruel words. For dying old men, George finished for him, his voice hardening. Those were your exact words according to multiple witnesses. Russell didn't deny it. Yes, sir, he admitted quietly. George stood up, and despite his calm demeanor, there was something imposing about his presence as he faced Russell directly. I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've worked with hundreds of security personnel at venues across this country. I understand it's a challenging job, but what I cannot understand, what I will never understand, is how anyone in this industry could forget that fans are the entire reason we exist. The room was completely silent now, everyone transfixed by the rare display of controlled anger. From the normally reserved country star, every ticket they buy, every mile they drive to a show, every hard-earned dollar they spend on music instead of something else, that's a gift, George continued. That's why I have a career at all. That's why you have a job. Russell stared at the floor, visibly shrinking under George's words. And yet, George went on, his voice growing more intense, when Mr. Thompson, a man who spent his medication money to see my show, a man who is literally facing the end of his life, when he approached you with nothing but respect and a simple request, you looked him in the eye and told him he wasn't worth my time. Russell flinched as his own words were thrown back at him. What gave you the right to make that judgment? George asked, stepping closer to Russell. Who are you to decide? Whose story matters and whose doesn't? No one, sir, Russell whispered. That's right, George agreed. No one. George turned to address Keller, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and respect. I assume he's been suspended? Keller nodded. Pending termination, yes. We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. George considered this for a moment, then turned back to face Russell. To everyone's surprise, his expression softened slightly. Firing him might be the easy solution, but I'm not sure it's the right one. All eyes in the room turned to George in surprise. Mr. Strait, Keller began carefully, I assure you we take this matter extremely seriously. George raised a hand to stop him. I believe you do, but there are two kinds of mistakes in this world. The kind we make because we don't know better, and the kind we make because we've forgotten what's important. He fixed his gaze on Russell again. I think yours was the second kind. Russell looked up, confusion mixing with the shame on his face. Tell me something, George continued. Before last night, had you ever really thought about what brings people to these shows, what the music means to them personally? Russell hesitated, then shook his head. Not really, sir. It was just a job to me. George nodded, as if that answer confirmed something for him. That's the real problem, isn't it? When we forget why we're all here in the first place. He turned to Harold, who had been watching the exchange with quiet dignity. Harold, what do you think? You're the injured party here, after all. Harold studied Russell thoughtfully. You know, he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been earlier, my father always told me that a man should be judged not by his mistakes, but by what he does after he makes them. He gestured toward Russell. This young man said some cruel things, no denying that, but I've lived long enough to know that most folks are doing the best they can with what they've got. Some days, that's better than others. George smiled, a genuine respect in his eyes. Wise words, Harold continued, addressing Russell directly now. Son, do you regret what you said to me? Russell met Harold's gaze for the first time. Yes, sir, I do. More than I can say. Harold nodded. Then as far as I'm concerned, that's a start. He glanced at George. Firing him doesn't teach him anything, does it? just sends him off to be someone else's problem. My thoughts exactly, George agreed. He turned back to Keller. I have a different proposal. Keller raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Instead of termination, I'd like to see Russell reassigned, not as security, but as part of a new initiative. George's eyes had taken on an intensity that caught everyone's attention. I want him to collect stories from fans, people like Harold, who have connected with music in profound ways. Document them, share them with your security team, use them as part of your training. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this unexpected suggestion. George continued, warming to his idea. With Harold's permission, I'd like Russell to start with his story, to understand why he came to that concert last night, what music has meant to him over the years, why it was so important for him to be there. He turned to Russell. Would you be willing to do that? To really listen and learn from people like Harold? Russell, still processing this unexpected turn, nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Absolutely. George looked to Harold. And would you be willing to share your stories with him? Help him understand what he's been missing? Harold's eyes twinkled with unexpected humor. Well, I'm not going anywhere for the moment. And I've been told I can talk the hind leg off a donkey when given the chance. If this young man wants to listen, I've got stories to tell. George smiled, then addressed Keller again. What do you think? Would your management team be open to this approach instead of simply firing him? Keller, who had been watching the exchange with growing admiration, nodded. Mr. Strait, coming from you, I think they'd be more than open to it. In fact, I believe it could be the beginning of something important for our entire organization. Good, George said with satisfaction. Then it's settled. He turned back to Russell. You'll start today. Sit with Harold. Listen to his stories. Understand why he came to that concert last night. And then we'll talk about expanding this to other venues, other fans. Russell, who had entered the room expecting to be publicly berated and fired, looked stunned by this unexpected second chance. Thank you, Mr. Strait. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything to me, George replied pointedly. It's Harold and fans like him you need to thank, the ones who make everything we do possible. A nurse appeared in the doorway, pausing when she saw the crowded room. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to check Mr. Thompson's vitals and change his bandage. Of course, George said, stepping back from Harold's bed. We should let you rest anyway. Will you come back? Harold asked, unable to hide the hope in his voice. George smiled warmly. Try and stop me. I want to hear more about that ranch of yours. Michael tells me it's been in your family for 4 generations. Harold nodded proudly. 4 generations, and counting, though I worry about what happens after. I'd like to talk to your grandchildren about that, George said, glancing at Sarah and Michael. I have some ideas that might help. As the others filed out to make room for the nurse, Russell hung back, awkwardly clutching his security cap in his hands. Mr. Thompson, he began hesitantly, I truly am sorry for what I said. It was cruel and wrong. Harold regarded him thoughtfully. Life's too short to hold grudges, son, especially when you're down to measuring it in weeks. He gestured to the chair beside his bed. Come back in a bit with that notebook Mr. Strait mentioned. I'll tell you about the time George Strait's music saved my ranch during the drought of '96. In the hallway, George pulled Sarah and Michael aside, speaking quietly. I meant what I said about your grandfather's ranch. I have some connections. People who specialize in helping family ranches stay operational through difficult transitions, if you're interested, that is. Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless. Michael found his voice first. That's incredibly generous, but why would you do all this for us? You just met Grandpa last night. George's expression grew thoughtful. You know, in this business, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers, album sales, ticket sales, chart positions. Sometimes it takes someone like your grandfather to remind me what it's really all about. He paused, glancing back toward Harold's room. "He wanted to thank me, but the truth is, I owe him a debt too." As George prepared to leave, promising to return that afternoon, his tour manager approached with a phone. "George, the Houston venue is calling about tomorrow night's show. With the rehearsal schedule delayed, cancel it," George said simply. The tour manager blinked in surprise. "Cancel? George, that's 22,000 tickets sold out." "Reschedule it for next month," George clarified. "I'm staying in Dallas for a few days. But the contract has penalties for last minute." "I'll cover them personally," George interrupted, his tone making it clear the decision was final. "Some things are more important than a schedule." This year, as word spread through the hospital about George Strait's extraordinary actions, postponing a major concert to spend time with an elderly fan, nurses and doctors found excuses to pass by Harold's room. Even patients who were ambulatory somehow ended up strolling past, hoping for a glimpse of the country music legend who was putting compassion above commerce. By afternoon, local news vans had gathered outside the hospital, and Harold's story had gone national. Social media exploded with the hashtag #CheckGeorgeAndHarold as people shared their own stories of what country music had meant to them through difficult times. Inside Harold's room, Russell sat with a notebook, recording the stories of a man he had dismissed just hours earlier. As Harold spoke about his life, his ranch, and the soundtrack that had accompanied his joys and sorrows for decades, Russell began to understand the true power of music, not just as entertainment, but as a companion through life's darkest and brightest moments. Down the hall, George Strait sat with Sarah and Michael in the hospital cafeteria, discussing practical ways to keep the Thompson Ranch viable after Harold's passing. His genuine concern and knowledge of ranching impressed them both, and for the first time since their grandfather's diagnosis, they felt a glimmer of hope that his legacy might continue. And in Nashville, other country music artists were already hearing about what was happening in that Dallas hospital room. By evening, several had reached out to George's management, asking how they could help, offering to visit Harold, or contribute to the emerging Every Fan's Story initiative that George had spontaneously created that morning. What had begun as a potential public relations disaster, an elderly fan falling on stage during a major concert, was transforming into something profound, a reminder of the deep, personal connection between artists and the people who find meaning in their music, a connection that Russell had dismissed with cruel words, but which George Strait understood was the very heart of why he had spent 40 years singing songs about life, love, and the human experience. As the day drew to a close, Harold Thompson drifted off to sleep with a peaceful smile on his face. His last conscious thought was of gratitude, not just for meeting his musical hero, but for discovering that the man behind the music was everything he had hoped he would be. The next 3 days transformed Harold Thompson's hospital room into something extraordinary. What had begun as a sterile medical space became a gathering place, a storytelling venue, and occasionally an impromptu concert hall. The stark white walls were now adorned with family photos that Michael and Sarah had brought from the ranch. Harold with Margaret on their 50th anniversary, on horseback in his younger days, holding his grandchildren as babies. A weathered cowboy hat, Harold's favorite, hung on a hook by the door. True to his word, George Strait returned each day. Sometimes he brought his guitar and played requests. Other times he simply sat and listened as Harold shared stories of his life on the ranch, of raising Sarah and Michael after their parents' accident, of the 6 decades he had spent loving Margaret. The two men discovered they had much in common: a love for ranching, similar upbringings in rural Texas, and deeply held values about family, hard work, and keeping your word. Russell, the security guard, had indeed become Harold's dedicated listener and recorder. Initially awkward and unsure, he had gradually relaxed as Harold's natural storytelling ability drew him in. The notebook George had suggested was now nearly full with Harold's recollections, wisdom, and the profound ways music had intersected with key moments in his life. "And that's why I Cross My Heart is special to me," Harold was saying as George entered the room on the fourth morning. "Margaret and I renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary, and our grandkids arranged for that song to play during the ceremony. Surprised us completely." Russell nodded, making another note. "That's beautiful, sir." George smiled from the doorway. "Sorry I'm late. Had to make a few calls." He was carrying a small duffel bag instead of his guitar case today. Harold brightened at his arrival. "George, we were just talking about wedding songs." "So I heard," George replied, setting down his bag and taking his now familiar seat beside the bed. "Sounds like I Cross My Heart has quite a history in your family." "It does indeed," Harold confirmed, "but I've been doing all the talking these past few days. How about you tell us some stories for a change? What was it like when you were first starting out?" George leaned back in his chair, a reminiscent smile crossing his face. "Well, it wasn't always arenas and tour buses, that's for sure. My first regular gig was playing with a band called Stony Ridge at a little bar in San Marcos while I was still in college. We'd get paid all of $50 for the whole band, plus free beer." Harold chuckled. "Not exactly the big time." "Not even close," George agreed. "But you know, there was something special about those days, too. Playing music because you loved it, not knowing if it would ever lead anywhere." As George shared stories from his early career, the struggles, the near misses, the moment he finally got signed to a record deal, a nurse appeared at the doorway, looking apologetic for interrupting. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Langston would like to speak with Ms. Thompson and Mr. Thompson," she said, referring to Sarah and Michael, who had been sitting quietly on a small sofa in the corner of the room. Sarah exchanged a concerned glance with her brother before they both stood. "We'll be right back, Grandpa," she assured Harold, following Michael and the nurse out of the room. When they returned 15 minutes later, their expressions were solemn. Harold, who'd been laughing at one of George's stories about life on the road, immediately noticed the change in their demeanor. "What is it?" he asked directly, never one to shy away from difficult truths. Sarah moved to his bedside, taking his hand in hers. "Dr. Langston says we can take you home, Grandpa, if that's what you want." "Home," Harold repeated, understanding the significance of what wasn't being said. Going home meant no more treatments, no more interventions. It meant the end was truly approaching. "He says there's nothing more they can do here," Michael added gently. "And he thought you might prefer to spend the time you have left at the ranch." Harold was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this news. Then he looked up at his grandchildren with surprising peace in his eyes. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I've always said I wanted to die in the same place I lived, on Thompson land." George had stood respectfully when Sarah and Michael returned, giving the family space for what he knew must be a difficult conversation. Now he cleared his throat softly. "I should give you folks some privacy," he said, reaching for his bag. "No, stay," Harold said quickly. "Please, what I have to say concerns you too." George paused, then nodded and resumed his seat. Harold took a deep breath. "These past few days have been a gift I never expected. Meeting you, George, sharing these conversations. It's been more than I could have hoped for." He turned to Russell. "Even you, young man. Listening to an old cowboy's stories like they matter." "They do matter, sir," Russell said quietly. Harold smiled. "Maybe so, but what matters most to me now is going home, seeing my ranch one last time, feeling that Texas dirt under my boots." "We'll make it happen, Grandpa," Sarah promised, wiping away a tear. "We'll bring you home tomorrow." "Today," Harold corrected gently. "I'd like to go today if the doctor says it's okay. No sense wasting whatever time I have left." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Michael put a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. "About that," George said, reaching for the duffel bag he had brought, "I took the liberty of making a few arrangements, assuming Dr. Langston would approve Harold going home soon." They all looked at him curiously. "I've chartered a medical helicopter to take you back to the ranch," George explained. "It's more comfortable than an ambulance for that distance, and faster too." Harold stared at him in disbelief. "A helicopter? George, that's too much. I can't accept—" "You can, and you will," George interrupted firmly but kindly. "Consider it repayment for all the concert tickets you've bought over the years." Before Harold could protest further, George continued, "And there's something else." He opened the duffel bag and pulled out a black cowboy hat. Not just any hat, but one instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with George Strait. "This is the hat I wore during my last tour," George said, holding it out to Harold. "I'd be honored if you'd accept it." Harold reached out with trembling hands to take the hat, his eyes filling with tears. "George, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," George assured him. "But there is one condition that comes with that hat." "What's that?" Harold asked. George's expression turned serious. "That you wear it when I come to visit you at the ranch next week, and the week after that, if you're up for company." Harold looked stunned. "You want to visit me at the ranch?" "If that's all right with you," George confirmed. "I meant what I said about wanting to hear more of your stories. And I thought I might bring my guitar along, play a few songs on your porch. I hear it's got a nice view." "The best in Texas," Harold said softly, still holding the hat as if it were made of glass. Sarah was staring at George in amazement. "You'd really do that? Come all the way out to our ranch?" "I would," George said simply. "In fact, I've already rearranged some things in my schedule." He turned back to Harold. "And I thought, if you're feeling up to it, we might even record some of those songs we've been playing. Nothing fancy, just acoustic versions, something for your family to keep." The room fell silent as the weight of this offer sank in. For Harold Thompson, lifelong fan of George Strait, to not only meet his musical hero, but to have him offer to record songs specifically for him and his family, it was beyond anything he could have imagined when he had decided to attend that concert 4 nights ago. "I'd be honored," Harold finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. By late afternoon, everything had been arranged. Dr. Langston had signed the discharge papers, a home health nurse had been scheduled to visit the ranch daily, and the medical helicopter George had chartered was waiting on the hospital's helipad. As orderlies prepared to transport Harold to the helicopter, George pulled Sarah and Michael aside in the hallway. "There's something else you should know," he said, lowering his voice. "I've spoken with my business manager. We're setting up a fund to cover Harold's medical expenses and home care, and I've also reached out to a friend who specializes in ranch management. He's willing to consult with you both about keeping the Thompson Ranch operational, if that's something you want to pursue after—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. After Harold was gone, the words hung unspoken in the air. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. "George, I don't know how we can ever thank you for all of this." "You don't need to thank me," George said firmly. "Your grandfather has given me something valuable too, a reminder of why I started making music in the first place. To connect with people, to be part of their stories." As they rejoined Harold, who was now being transferred to a gurney for transport to the helicopter, Russell approached George somewhat hesitantly. "Mr. Strait," he began, "I've been thinking about what you said, about collecting fans' stories. I was wondering if I could continue this project with other artists and venues, even after my time with Mr. Thompson is done." George studied him thoughtfully. "You've really taken this to heart, haven't you?" Russell nodded earnestly. "These past few days, listening to Mr. Thompson, it's changed how I see everything about my job, about music, about what it means to people." "That sounds like a fine idea," George agreed. I'd be happy to put in a word with some venue managers, see if we can make it an industry-wide initiative. As they prepared to move Harold to the helipad, he beckoned Russell closer to his gurney. "You'll come to the ranch too," Harold said. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Bring that notebook of yours. We've still got stories to finish." Russell smiled, the first genuine smile they had seen from him. "Yes, sir. I'd like that very much." The journey to the Thompson Ranch was smooth, the medical helicopter making the trip in a fraction of the time it would have taken by road. As they approached the property, Harold asked the pilot to circle once, allowing him to see the full expanse of the land that had been in his family for 4 generations, the house he had built with his own hands, the barn where he had taught his grandchildren to ride, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary where he and Margaret had often picnicked on summer evenings. When the helicopter landed in a flat area near the house, a small group of neighbors had gathered, alerted by Sarah's calls earlier in the day. They stood respectfully aside as Harold was helped from the helicopter into a wheelchair, but their presence was a testament to the impact he had made on his community over the decades. George Strait, who had followed in a separate helicopter with Russell, stepped out to find himself immediately embraced by the small crowd of ranchers and townspeople who couldn't believe that the king of country was standing on Thompson land. With gracious patience, he shook hands and signed a few autographs, but made it clear his priority was Harold. As Harold was wheeled toward the house, he suddenly raised a hand, asking them to stop. "I want to stand," he said firmly. "I want to walk into my home on my own 2 feet." The home health nurse who had accompanied them looked concerned. "Mr. Thompson, I don't think—" "It's not up for discussion," Harold interrupted, already pushing himself up from the wheelchair. Sarah and Michael moved quickly to support him on either side. George stepped forward. "Here," he said, offering his arm as additional support. "We'll do it together." With George on one side and Michael on the other, with Sarah hovering close behind, ready to catch him if he faltered, Harold Thompson walked the short distance to his front porch. Each step was labored, each breath an effort, but the determination in his eyes never wavered, and on his head, proud and prominent, sat George Strait's black cowboy hat. As they reached the porch steps, 3 wooden steps that Harold had replaced just last summer, he paused to catch his breath. "Never thought these steps would feel like climbing a mountain," he murmured. "Take your time," George encouraged. "No rush." Harold nodded, gathered his strength, and with the help of the 3 people surrounding him, climbed those 3 steps to his porch. When he reached the top, he turned slowly to look out over his land, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pastures where his cattle still grazed. "This view never gets old," he said softly. "No, it doesn't," George agreed, recognizing in that vista something familiar from his own ranch. The peace that comes from working the land, from building, something that lasts, from creating a legacy that would continue long after you were gone. As they helped Harold into the house, into the living room where he and Margaret had raised their family, where they had danced in the evenings to George Strait songs playing on the radio, something shifted in the atmosphere. Harold was home. Whatever time he had left would be spent where he belonged, surrounded by the memories and the people he loved most. That evening, as Harold rested in his favorite recliner by the window, George brought in his guitar from the helicopter. Without fanfare or introduction, he began to play "The Chair," the song that had started it all at the concert that now seemed so long ago. As the familiar melody filled the room, Harold closed his eyes, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. When George finished, Harold opened his eyes again and looked around at the people gathered in his living room, his grandchildren, his neighbors who had become like family, Russell with his ever-present notebook, and George Strait himself, no longer just an idol on a distant stage, but now a friend. "Thank you," Harold said simply, his gaze meeting George's, "for making this old cowboy's last ride a good one." George nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken between them. "It's been my honor, Harold, truly." In the days that followed, word spread throughout the country music community about what George Strait was doing for Harold Thompson. Other artists began to reach out, offering to visit the ranch and play for Harold as well. Soon, a schedule had formed, one artist each day, coming to share their music and hear Harold's stories. True to his word, George returned every week. Sometimes he brought other country legends with him. Other times he came alone. On his third visit, he brought recording equipment as promised, and together with Harold, they selected 10 songs that had special meaning to the Thompson family. These they recorded simply, just George's voice and guitar, with Harold occasionally joining in when he had the strength. The collection, which George privately titled Songs for Harold, would never be commercially released. It was created for one man and his family, a gift beyond price, a testament to the power of music to forge connections that transcend fame and fortune. For 6 remarkable weeks, Harold Thompson defied his doctor's predictions. Whether it was the joy of being home, the visits from George and other artists, or simply his own stubborn determination, he rallied in a way no one had expected. There were good days and bad, of course, days when he could sit on the porch and enjoy the sunset, and days when the pain kept him confined to his bed. But through it all, there was music. And there were stories being told and recorded, not just by Russell now, but by a team of documentarians who had been inspired by Harold's story and George's response to it. When Harold Thompson finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, 7 weeks after returning to his ranch, he did so having lived more fully in those final weeks than many people do in years. He went out on his own terms, in his own home, with his cowboy hat, George Strait's cowboy hat, hanging on the bedpost beside him. The funeral was held at the small church in town where Harold and Margaret had been married 60 years earlier. To no one's surprise, George Strait attended, slipping quietly into a back pew just before the service began. What did surprise everyone was that he had brought his guitar, and when the minister asked if anyone would like to say a few words, George stood and made his way to the front. "Harold once told me that music says the things we can't find words. For," George began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident on his face, "so I'd like to say goodbye to my friend the best way I know how." With that, he began to play Go On, a song about letting go and moving forward, about cherishing memories while accepting loss. As his rich baritone filled the small church, there wasn't a dry eye to be found, not among Harold's family and friends, not among the townsfolk who had known him all his life, and not from George Strait himself, who let his tears fall freely as he sang farewell to a man who had started as a fan but had become much more. 3 months later, at the Country Music Association Awards, George Strait received the Humanitarian of the Year award for his work with Harold Thompson and the initiative that had grown from it, a program now called Every Fan's Story, which trained venue staff across the country to recognize the profound connection between artists and the people who love their music. In his acceptance speech, brief as always, George said simply, "This award doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Harold Thompson and every fan who has ever felt that music was more than entertainment, that it was a lifeline, a companion through good times and bad. Their stories matter, and as long as I can sing, I'll never forget that." Back at the Thompson Ranch, now being run by Michael with help from the consultant George had arranged, Harold's weathered cowboy hat hung in a place of honor in the living room. Beside it was a framed photograph of Harold and George sitting on the porch, guitars across their laps, caught in mid-laugh by Sarah's camera. And on the small table beneath it sat a simple plaque that read, "For Harold Thompson Rancher, grandfather, friend whose last encore reminded us all why music matters."